Dear God, I pray that this church would see the vision and that we would make room for people. God, I pray that it would never just be about that, though, that we would also care about the people that are here, that we would help them to grow in their faith and to find a place to belong. Help us, God, to have your heart for people. As we move into your word, God, I pray that people would see past me and that they would see your heart. God, as we talk about some really important stuff this morning, I pray, God, that they would hear from you. In Jesus' precious and holy name, amen. Several years ago, I got a call, and it was about 11:30 at night. I was staying up, and I was watching ESPN, and all of a sudden, my dad called, and he said, Eric is gone. He's no longer with us. And I don't know if it was because my dad wasn't very clear in what he said, or if what I heard was so emotionally overwhelming that I couldn't actually process it. And it took me a few minutes to realize that he had just told me that my younger brother was killed in a car crash. And it was so sudden, it was so final, and I couldn't quite understand it. I found myself a couple days later on an airplane to Texas, and when I got there, my brother wasn't walking with God at all. And all of the people that he was hanging out with didn't know God either, and they ended up having a funeral in one of the most unique places I've ever been. They had a funeral, and the place was packed in a bar. And as I got done giving the sermon, and as I got done talking to people, and as I stood in line with people who were confused, who were overwhelmed, came up to me, and one by one, they kept asking me the same question. How is it possible for you to have so much peace in the midst of such difficult circumstances? We're going to talk about things this morning that I wished I never would have learned. We're going to talk about things that have impacted me so profoundly, it's changed the way that I do everything in life. So if you would, open up your Bibles with me to John chapter 11, and in just a couple minutes, we're going to start in verse 1. We're in the last week of a series on the 7 I Ams of Jesus. And John, he does his gospel completely different than all the other authors. All the other authors kind of have a chronological view, and they try to organize things in certain thoughts. And what John does is he organizes them according to significance and meaning. He has taken multiple years to really sit down, reflect, and process, and lay it all out. And what he does is he lays out 7 signs or 7 miracles and shows us what Jesus did and how we should follow this guy. It's proof that Jesus is the Messiah. He's a long-awaited promised one that God has given, and he goes through, and in this talk that we're going to do today, it highlights 2 of them about what he did to the crippled person in John chapter 5 and also the person that was blind. But today we're going to focus specifically on the 7th one where he heals Lazarus. Not only that, but we're going to focus on Jesus' words, which were so controversial, which were so amazing and so interesting that I just want us to sit with it. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. As we start in John's gospel in chapter 11, verse 1, here's the situation. Now a man, Lazarus, was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And then he gives us some details because he understands that people have already read Luke and already read Mark. And he tells us what he's going to tell us in chapter 12, but he wants us to introduce us to them to know it's the same exact people. So the sisters went to send word, I skip down to verse 3, to Jesus. And here's what they said, Lord, the one you love is sick. And they specifically point out that, hey, Jesus, our brother, the one that you deeply love, that guy is sick. Jesus responds by saying, the sickness will not end in death. It is for God's glory, so that the Son may be glorified through it. And I just want to highlight this, that there's something about God's glory that's really important to Jesus, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, Jesus loved Martha, and this is the second time that he wants every single person to understand that Jesus absolutely loved Martha and Mary and Lazarus, and they were very important to him. And when they sent him a message, he does something that just seems so strange. He says, so when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed there 2 more days. Why does Jesus deliberately wait 2 days after he hears the request from Mary and Martha? Maybe an interesting thing is if you were Jesus and someone you cared about deeply and they were vulnerable and reached out to you and sent to you in their deepest time of need, what would you have done in that moment? I don't know about most of you, but what I would have done is when somebody's critically ill and I've got the power to heal, I would have healed her immediately. I want to slow down for a second because there's some people that you sent a message to Jesus. There's some of you here that you were facing a difficult time, and when you absolutely needed God to come through, and he didn't do what you knew he should have done. You needed him, and he wasn't there. You wanted him to respond a certain way, and you absolutely believed with all your heart that was the best response according to the circumstances right there, and it has hurt you. Some of you have felt disregarded and unimportant and alone because when you needed God, he did not do what you knew he should have done. I can imagine Mary and I can imagine Martha and their brother who Jesus loved was sick, and they thought if we just get word to Jesus, then he will heal him and he will respond. But he didn't. What would you have done if you had the opportunity to respond in that same situation? You see, Jesus didn't respond in the way that Mary and Martha thought he should. But not only that, he didn't respond in the way that the disciples thought he should. If you read the Gospels, there's something interesting that happens is Jesus is talking and he's doing miracles, and as he does each miracle, two things happen. A few people believe, and then the opposition grows deeper and wider. And every single time Jesus does a miracle, the people that are opposed to him, especially the religious, self-righteous people, get more angry, more bitter, more frustrated, more resolved that they are going to silence Jesus and kill him. And it's got so bad, by the time we end up in chapter 10 of John's Gospel, they are wanting to stone Jesus, and they are wanting to stop his message. So the disciples are like, I am so glad when those women sent Jesus the message, he didn't go, because we don't want to be anywhere near Jerusalem, because I know the next time we go, we're going to die. Because Jesus has already told them 3 different times, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and I'm going to irritate the chief priests and the elders, and they're going to get so irritated that they're going to kill me, and I am going to die. And I can imagine all the disciples going, there's no way, I don't want any part of that. And then he said to the disciples, let's go back to Judea. That's the region around Jerusalem. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago, the Jews, and I want to highlight in this red, because if you understand John's gospel, and as you read the pieces, when he's talking about Jews, he's not just talking about a national race. He's talking about the people who specifically were connected to the religious elite leaders that were wanting to silence Jesus. The last time we were there, they tried to stone you, and yet you want to go back? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by the world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they will stumble, for they have no light. And what Jesus is doing is he's saying that you guys have a different priority system than I do. You guys are interested in comfort. You guys are afraid of death, and you're afraid of difficult circumstances. By the way, Jesus wasn't afraid of any of those things. The only thing Jesus was concerned about was being outside of the will of God. And he just got telling us that he was the light of the world that was going to bring us to God. And now he's saying the only thing that matters to me is I want to make sure that I'm in the center of what God's doing. Why does Jesus deliberately go to Jerusalem when there's real danger from religious people that are about to kill him? Now, I don't know about you, but what I would have done is I would have stayed as far away from Jerusalem as possible. What would you have done? How do you survive your pain when God doesn't act in the way that you should? You have to offer your questions to the only one that can handle your confusion. Throughout the scriptures, we are completely aware of what God should do. And there's certain times when we cry out to him and we want him to change the circumstances. We want him to heal us, make our pain go away, or stop the things that are happening, and God doesn't respond. And we don't understand, and it's confusing, and it's overwhelming. And I want to say to you that it's okay to question. It's okay to search for answers and figure out why in the world isn't this working. Some of you have reached out to God. Some of you have called out to him. And in your desperate moment, just like Mary and Martha, he did not answer you, and you're left with questions. I want to encourage you that there's someone that can handle those questions, and he doesn't get offended. He doesn't get upset. He will never get defensive. He will receive them and help you to find the answers you're ultimately looking for. After he had said this, he went to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, and I love how confusing Jesus is. I think what Jesus is ultimately getting to is that death itself isn't final, and it's a temporary thing, and it doesn't mean it's the end. But the disciples didn't catch any of that stuff. They thought it meant that Jesus was saying that he's just tired, he just fell asleep, he's going to wake up, and everything's going to be okay. In verse 13, Jesus had been speaking of his death. That's Lazarus' death. But his disciples thought, now I want to make sure we catch this, because the disciples were clueless as to what God was doing. Now, I want to suggest that when we find ourselves in difficult circumstances, could it just be possible that we don't understand everything that God's doing? You see, Mary and Martha didn't get it. The disciples didn't get it. Everybody was confused and they didn't understand. And I just want you to consider the possibility that maybe God understands things on a deeper and more significant level than what you might have given him credit for. Verse 14, so then they told them plainly, Jesus did, Lazarus is dead. And now Jesus is about to say something that seems so selfish, so cold, so indifferent. He says, I am glad that I wasn't there. Look what he says. For your sake, I'm glad I was not there. If you understand what John's trying to accomplish is he's telling specific stories with the purpose of helping people to believe. Because he knows that when he gets there to Jerusalem, near Jerusalem at Lazarus' place, he's going to do something that's going to cause the disciples to be able to believe. I'm glad I was not there so that you might believe, but let's go to him. It's the second time Jesus says we're going there to Lazarus. And all the disciples have the exact same response, but one of them, who happens to be the spokesman at that moment, is Thomas, otherwise known as Didymus. He's the guy that everyone knows for being doubting. I think he was courageous because he said out loud what everybody else was feeling. Okay, Jesus, if we have to go to Jerusalem, then that will be our last week that we're alive, and everything that we've worked toward is going to come to a conclusion, and it's not going to be good because the last time we went there, it was about 6 days ago, they tried to stone you. Don't you remember how bad it was? And Thomas just kind of has this unbelievable faith and says, okay, I'm willing to go, and I'm willing to resign myself to do what you want us to do. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. As you kind of look back at the situation, when Jesus first heard Lazarus was already dead, and Jesus knew that, no one else did, but he was going to do something beyond their comprehension. Well, I'm kind of glad, because we learn that Jesus has power to raise people who are so dead that their body is starting to rot. And it's not something necessary to celebrate, other than the fact that God has power to raise us no matter what the circumstances might be. People sometimes come to me that have their parents or their loved ones buried, and they want to know, would it be okay if we had them cremated? And this verse and lots of other ones tell us that Jesus is able to take people who have been dead for more than 4 days and bring them back to life, which, by the way, it's kind of cool. We live in a world that people do not ever think about death. We live in a world where everyone has completely denied death and anesthetized ourselves to the fact that we don't even have to think about it. But as far as I understand things, 1 out of every 1 person ultimately ends up dying. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. That's why the disciples didn't want to go there. And many Jews, and the reason I continue to highlight this is because the Jews were representing the religious people that were spying on Jesus so that they could trick him and arrest him. had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. And the way it works back then is when somebody died, there would be a whole bunch of relatives, and then there would be a whole bunch of hired people that would come alongside and they would mourn. And when I was in Ethiopia, I saw something very similar to it. There was a guy that died, and then there was an entire procession that was walking through the land, and there were hundreds of people that didn't even really know this guy very well, and they were all mourning and crying as they walked through. And that's what was taking place back then. Verse 20, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. But Mary stayed at home. And watch what Martha does. She came up to Jesus and she said, if you would have been here, if you would have been here, he would not have died. Some of you know exactly what Martha was feeling. Some of you have been vulnerable and you've reached out to God and he had the power to do something and he chose not to, and you can't hardly handle it. And here's Martha going to Jesus. If you would have been here, if you would have been here, it wouldn't have happened. If you would have been here and if you would have responded, if you would have listened to me and if you would have done it, he would not have died. Some of you have been taught that questions are not okay. And I want to encourage you that God not only will receive your questions, but he'll care about you in the entire process. How do you survive your pain when God doesn't act in the way that you think he should? Not only do you have to offer your questions to the one who can help you navigate the confusion, but be willing to receive comfort from the one that is deeply moved by your personal situation. If it would have been me and if I would have responded and Martha asked me that question, I would have first of all got very defensive, and then I would have tried to communicate my intentions, and I probably would have pushed her away. But Jesus didn't do that. He responded to her in a way that is powerful and meaningful, and I want you to catch how he responded. But I know that even now, and Martha's talking, that God will give you whatever you ask. He's saying, Jesus, I know that if you, even in this moment, stepped up, something cool could happen. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he'll rise again at the resurrection, the last day. I know someday, ultimately, way off in the future, that none of us ever think about, that time, he is going to rise me. He's going to rise Lazarus. Jesus said to her, and this is interesting because I want you to consider this, I am the resurrection. He didn't say I have power over life. He said, I am the resurrection. I am the resurrection and the life. Now, that is a bold statement unless it just happens to be true. The one who believes in me will live, and this is the part I love, even though he dies. You see, Jesus understood something on such a significantly deeper and richer level than either Martha or Mary could even understand. And he said, if you believe in me, then you will live even though you die. And whoever lives a life that's characterized by believing in me, you will never die. And then Jesus asks her a question. Do you believe this? Some of you have never thought about death. Some of you have never even thought about it because it's too painful and it's too scary and it's too far out and it's something that will never happen to you. Do you believe that he has the power over life and death, and he has the power to raise you from the dead and ultimately take you all the way into eternity? Watch her response because it is so cool. Yes, Lord, she replied, I believe that you're the Messiah. You're the one that the Old Testament has promised us. You're the Son of God who's come into the world. And after she said this, she went back and she called her sister Mary. Now, if I would have responded to Martha, she would have been pushed away. She would have been more upset, more frustrated. But the way Jesus responded was so cool and so meaningful that she runs out, gets her sister, and says, you got to go talk to Jesus. He's here and he wants to talk to you. The teacher is here, she said, and asking for you. Verse 29, when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and she went up to him. Now, Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews, that's the people that were spying on Jesus, doing the mourning, saw what was happening, watch this. Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out. They followed her, supposing she had gone to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was, she fell at her feet and she said the exact same words her sister had. Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. And I can imagine the scene. Here's Jesus, and he's already talked to one sister, and it's hard enough to endure her grief, but then the other sister comes, and she's got the same fears and the same worries, and she's overwhelmed, and she says, if you'd have been here, this would not have happened. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved, and he was troubled in his spirit. If you read any other translation other than the NIV, it says that he was deeply moved and he was angry. Some people said that the reason he was angry is because he was disappointed in the women and his disciples because they didn't have any faith. And some people say that the reason he was angry is because of the religious people that were in hypocrisy pretending to go along, and they were weeping and crying, and he was angry at that. I don't think he was angry at either one of those things. I think what he was angry is death itself and how devastating it is. And I think it was a combination of mixed emotions, which we feel when we lose somebody important. It's a combination of deep, abiding sadness that cuts to the core of our being, along with frustration and anger for what death brings and how final and destructive that is on people's life. And here's Jesus, deeply moved and troubled. Verse 34, and where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord. And they replied. And then this is the shortest verse in the Bible, but it might have the most profound meaning. Jesus wept. And I can imagine Jesus getting close to the tomb, and it's too much. And he's crying and he's weeping. And he's weeping so much that these religious people who were sent to spy on him said, you can obviously tell how deeply he loved this guy. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him? But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of a blind man have kept them from dying? Probably about 6 months ago, this had taken place. And these people were spying on him that time, and they said, he was able to restore sight to someone who had never been able to see. And if he had the power to do that, then certainly he could have healed Lazarus. Does anyone know exactly what that feels like? God, why? I don't get it. I don't understand how you allowed it to happen. We have a family in our church, and it doesn't make any sense. And I'm convinced he should have done it a different way. And yet, he didn't. He had the power, and he didn't do it, and it's overwhelming. Jesus once more, just in case you don't catch this, deeply moved. What should we do when we find ourselves in a situation where God doesn't respond the way we want him to? We can take all of our questions to the only one that can help us make sense of them. We can go to the one that so deeply cares about our situation that he responds with compassion. I don't want you to miss this, because if you just read through this passage, you will miss it. You will completely miss how involved emotionally and how present Jesus was. Did you know that when people are hurting and suffering, they don't need answers to their questions? They need a compassionate, empathetic response of someone who is emotionally present in that moment. It was a cave. And I love that Jesus is able to handle all of our concerns and questions. And I love it, the fact that he is compassionate and cares about us and is willing to engage us in the moment and care about what we're suffering through. But I also am amazed that Jesus always responds with the perfectly appropriate response for what the circumstances require at that moment. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha. Martha was saying, I know you could do some amazing stuff. But then she says, in the King James, it says this, he stinketh. Or for all of you junior high boys, there's a really bad odor. By this time, there was a bad odor, for he had been there 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, then you're going to be able to see God's glory? We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So they took away the stone. Jesus looked up and he said, and this is one of the coolest prayers in the Bible and not one I would recommend. Have you ever been around somebody who prays a prayer and they're not talking to God, they're actually talking to you or other people? I've watched sometimes where wives are praying and they're not really talking to God, but they're talking to their husband so that they can say, if he would just understand, then I need him to love me. This is not what I'm recommending normally, but Jesus does one of the most interesting prayers in all the Bible. And he says, God, I'm not praying so that you'll hear me. I'm praying out loud so everybody else will be able to understand that you always listen to me and do what I want. And I can imagine John, after taking time to reflect it, that was the weirdest prayer Jesus ever prayed. And we're in the midst of it, and he's telling us that I'm not really talking to you, but I'm just saying it out loud because I want you to catch something. And after multiple years of processing through this, he was able to discern and figure out that what he was doing was helping them to be able to see something beyond their initial ability to understand it at the moment. Father, I thank you that you heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they might believe. And I can imagine John pulling these details together, saying, he prayed something and then he did something that was so powerful, it made it possible for me to believe. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice. And if you understand John's whole gospel, in chapter 5, he was saying that there's coming a day where I'm going to go and I'm going to speak to people who have died and are in the tombs, and I'm going to call their specific name, and they're going to hear my voice. And here comes Jesus at this ultimate moment, and he walks up to the tomb, and I am so glad that he said Lazarus' name. 2 reasons: because he knows our name, and because if he would have just said, come forth, can you imagine the chaos? It would have been unbelievable what took place in that day. Lazarus came out, the dead man came out with his hands wrapped, and he had grave clothes tied all around him, and everybody had to tie and untie him so that they could realize that it was real and it was taking place in the moment. Therefore, many Jews who had come to visit Mary had seen what Jesus did. They believed in him, just like every other miracle. But just like every other miracle, some of the Jews didn't believe. They did something else. Verse 46, but some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. You see, they replied back because their purpose was to spy on Jesus. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees, that's who they were talking to, called a meeting of the Sanhedrin, and they said, what in the world are we accomplishing? Because if we allow this to go on unchecked, then something's going to happen, and we're going to lose all of our power, all of our influence, all of our say. We have got to do something now. And if you keep reading on, Caiaphas talks up and he says, if people only understood what needs to take place is we've got to kill this Jesus, because if we kill Jesus, then it will be better for not only us, but the entire nation and the world. And they came to this conclusion at the end. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. And then at the end, the chief priests and the religious leaders and all the elite decided and made a declaration that if anyone sees Jesus show up, that what you have to do is immediately capture him so that we can arrest him and stop his message. How do you survive the pain when God doesn't act the way that he should? First, you got to come to him and offer your genuine questions to the only one that can receive it and help you make sense of it. You got to be willing to receive the comfort from the one who is deeply moved by your pain. And here's the hard one, is you got to release the outcomes to the one that acts in perfect accord with what the circumstances require. You see, it's kind of ironic because Jesus is the one who gives life. But the method Jesus chose to give life was by giving his own life on the cross. And by giving life to Lazarus, he set in motion the events that ultimately caused his death. The raising of Lazarus is the final miracle that perfectly sets the stage to accomplish what all the signs have pointed to. You see, he finally irritated the religious people enough that they were willing to do what it took to kill him and take him to a cross. And God provided life through the death of his son. Remember when I was telling you about my brother? And I got that call, and it was at 11:30 at night. Just before that, I got a call. And this call was one I never wanted to get. We got a call saying, hey, you guys have to come because Dad's about to die. And it was my wife's dad who had just had a heart attack. And we went to Michigan. And we had to make decisions that you should never have to make. And we decided we'd do everything we could to keep him alive, and we did everything we could to do that, but no matter what we tried, we couldn't get the liquid off of his lungs. And his heart attack ultimately led towards his death, and all of us were like, I don't understand this, and it's certainly not what I wish we would have done. And I went to do the funeral for my father-in-law, and I was exhausted and worn out. We got back, and that's when I got the call that my brother was killed in a car crash. I went to Texas and did my younger brother's funeral, and I got back, and we hadn't recovered from any of it. And we were overwhelmed with grief, and we got another phone call from my wife's brother. And he said that my wife's mom, who she dearly loved, had a brain aneurysm. And the next thing I knew, we were on a plane, and I was doing my third funeral. And it was exhausting, and it was overwhelming emotionally. And we got back to town, and I was completely overwhelmed, and I got another phone call. And this phone call was from my mother-in-law, and she said that Dad is not doing good. You should come now. So we ended up getting tickets. We flew to Dallas, and my dad, who was one of the strongest people I ever knew, he was over 200 pounds, had gone to where he was under 100 pounds. And I had to kneel down and help my dad get in the bathtub. And it was one of the most stressful and overwhelming moments I'd ever experienced. And it was so stressful and so overwhelming that we couldn't handle being in the environment where death was present. So we ended up leaving. And we came back to Minnesota, and we were here for 1 day. And he died. And then we got to go back, and I ended up doing my fourth funeral in 8 months. And 1 day, 4 people in my immediate family died unexpectedly. And now that I've had some time to reflect on it, now that I've had some time to experience it, I had all kinds of questions, and God was able to help me navigate every single one. In the midst of every single stage along the way, God comforted me in my grief. God was compassionate, and He cared about me and helped me to be able to survive even stuff I never wished would have happened. And only with the result of time do I get to see how He was controlling the outcomes for things that I didn't even have the beginnings to understand what He was going to ultimately do through that. I don't know about you and where you're at. And some of you are just overwhelmed and you've got questions, and I would encourage you to take them to the one who can help you navigate them. I would encourage you to allow God to do what only He can, which is to bring you comfort. And I would willingly encourage you to see things from a different perspective, because He always responds with what the situation perfectly requires. You see, if it would have been up to me, I would have healed Lazarus immediately. I would have avoided Jerusalem altogether, and I would have answered the women's questions. But Jesus did it in such a way that He delivered on what they really need, solved our greatest problem, which is death itself, and proved for all time throughout the centuries that God is not indifferent and He cares about us in the midst of our pain. I want to stand here and I want to tell you that I don't understand. And sometimes I don't like it. But I found the place that you can take your questions, your concerns, and your struggles to the one who can actually deal with them. Dear Heavenly Father, I know there's people here that are in pain. And I know there's people who don't like the way you've chosen to do things. And I pray, God, that instead of becoming bitter and angry and resentful, that they would move towards the one who cares. Give him the courage to wrestle with those questions and bring them to you, and you won't get defensive, and you'll help us navigate them. God, I pray that we would see that you always respond with so much bigger picture than what we can imagine in the moment. Help us to turn it over to you. In Jesus' precious and holy name, amen.